Icons! Icons, icons, icons! Everyone loves icons, so you love icons, and you want to put them in all your videos to spice things up. Like, you could spend a lot of time and money trying to plan and schedule a shoot for B-roll on how the financial markets work, or you could just slap a big old line graph icon on the screen and call it a day. But when it comes to your videos, you don't want to just look like you're copying and pasting them. No, you want to be super cool and have them animate. So I'm going to show you how to turn these into these in After Effects.
Yay!
But do you suck at After Effects? Don't worry! Each one of these icons have been animated in 3 different ways, from simple to complicated, so you can build up to not sucking. But more importantly, you'll leave the series with a process that you can use, so you can look at any icon and figure out your own way of animating it tastefully. But before we get into it, this video is brought to you by that light switch. You know the one. That light switch. Yeah, we don't know what it does either. Okay, so whenever I'm asked to animate icons, there are 3 different questions I ask myself to start the brainstorming. First, can I break the icon into shapes or line groupings? Like, this may be a computer monitor, but it's also 2 rectangles with a line and a dot. This phone here is maybe more like 3 stacked rectangles, or perhaps 2 rectangles that have these lines that separate them. And when you think about it as circles, squares, triangles, and lines, you can start to overlap, split them up, and use the shapes and do lots of cool things. Like, I can imagine that this screen here hides the stand and maybe it pops up. We can also look at the lines to suggest the direction for motion, which I love to use. Like, these lines on the cell phone feel like they're moving out from the center. So maybe that's exactly what it does. We can have these 2 rectangles that are pushing apart to reveal the screen. Play around with it in your mind's eye and experiment. A bunch of simple movements combined together can make something look quite complex and sophisticated. Secondly, is there any real-world movement that I can use as inspiration? Like, for me, on the laptop, what if I somehow reinforce the idea of it being a laptop by having it open up like one? And finally, how will the animation be used and how long will it be on screen? Because honestly, if you only need it for 5 seconds, or maybe if it's one of hundreds of icons on screen, it might not be worth it or counterproductive to make the animation very elaborate. So knowing how it's going to be used and planning out how much you should care in the grand scheme of things is very useful. Okay, enough theory. Let's push some pixels around. Okay, so we're on my PC right now, and we have that first icon open of the computer screen. So if we think back to those questions that we're asking ourselves, can we break this down into simpler objects? What can we take away from the real life functionality of the object? I keep on coming back to this, that we have a rectangle here on top, and we got a rectangle here on bottom. And I think it'll actually look quite polished if we have that big rectangle reveal that smaller rectangle behind, like if it moves up and we see that bracket. Let's go ahead and get our stuff into After Effects and get that going. We're going to keep this first animation real simple. We're going to learn about masking, how we use masks to hide and to show objects. And then we're going to keyframe our assets. Then we're going to explain the power of nulls and parenting when we get into the keyframing and kind of connecting things up. And then we're going to polish off this animation with some easy ease. So we've got After Effects open, and this is a new project, and what I have done is created 2 basic folders. You don't have to copy me, but it's important in whatever way, organize your files. Like whether it's my way or some other way you see, just keep it organized so when you go into it later or somebody else goes into it, you're not super embarrassed. So because we're upstanding citizens, we have legally procured this icon, and they gave us an SVG. This is slightly tangential to what we want to talk about, but problem is we can't import the SVG. So I have converted that into a Illustrator file and also a JPEG to show you an issue that you may run into with this style of animating. So I'm going to highlight both of those project files. I'm going to bring them into my untitled project here, put those into my assets folder because we're organizing stuff. And I'm going to save this, and we'll call this one the computer screen. Always good to save. All right, we've got these here, and I'm going to create a new composition. I'm going to name this computer screen icon. 1920, 1080, 30 frames. Yeah, we'll leave that. We can always change this later. 1920, 1080. That is what is it? YouTube, Instagram, It's on Twitter. I mean, it's like MasterCard. It's everywhere you want to be. So we got that. Good. Bada bing, bada boom. I'm going to put that in my compositions. Going to save again because crashing is terrible. And we have this. My screen is white. Yours may be transparent. You can toggle that with this button down here that says toggle transparency grid. If it's not white, you can also go to the hamburger icon here on your timeline and go to composition settings, or you can go up here to the top and go to composition settings, and then you can set your background color. And that's just important for us right now because our illustration is just a bunch of lines and they're black lines. So if you had black lines on a black screen, you won't be able to see anything. If I drag this here, it's super tiny, but we'll get into that. But if you can see with the transparency, very difficult to see. So why do we need some sort of vector illustration? A vector meaning that we've taken this image and it's actually a bunch of math to make it. There's a bunch of calculations to make the curves and stuff like that. So you can take a vector illustration and you can blow it up to the size of a building or keep it super small like an icon here. But you can't do that with pixel-based stuff. So even though we've got this computer AI and I can bring in this computer.jpg and move it over, which is interesting that you can see that we've got the white solid behind it. Let's go back to this mode. If I go out here, hit S for scale, and I scale these up, let's call it 900 and 900, you see that they are hot piles of mess. However, because our AI file is actually a vector file, we can go ahead and toggle our switches or modes, or we can hit F4. Again, shortcuts, know them. We can go to this middle button here, and it is a continuously rasterize, or use those computations and maths, and we can see that now, oops, I hit caps lock, that disables refresh, and we can see now that we can make that super crispy, it's super sexy, but our JPEG, we can't do that there. There's no option to continuously rasterize because it's pixel based. So the bigger it gets, the trashier it becomes. And that's all I want to say about that. I've already spent too much time on it. I mean, the rest of this video will work if it was a appropriate size. So if there was a 1910 by 1080 JPEG or GIF of this image or PNG and you brought that in and it looked fine at this size, then you could use that. But we don't have that. I was too lazy to make that. So I'm going to delete this JPEG from our lives and just use this Illustrator file. So I'm going to move it generally around the center. Now, when we think back to when we were trying to break it down, we're like, all right, we need those two rectangles, so let's break this computer file down into that. And we can do that by using masks. And like a Halloween mask, we can hide things, or that's a terrible analogy. Masks are kind of like windows, and we can use these windows to show things or to hide things. So if we highlight our layer here, and we go up to our toolbar, and we select either our pen tool or our rectangle tool, like the shape tools, we can use that to draw out a mask. And so you can sort of see with this peach colored mask that I am telling the computer what I want to show. So I'm going to drag that down here and just do our top rectangle or the screen. And it doesn't have to be precise here. Even if we goofed, we can fix it. Like you can sort of see we got a little bit of the bottom here. But if we highlight that mask here, go here to our selection tool, and we can select these points and use our arrow keys to make that precise. So masks, yeah, we can show stuff. We can also hide it. So right now, if we go down to our timeline, and if you don't see this and the caret's up, you can twirl that down, go to the mask, and over here it says add. Well, we can invert that, and now we're showing just that bottom bracket. Or instead of inverting it, we can say like, hey, don't add, as in like anything within this selection, add it to show it's visible. We can do subtract, and it's doing the same thing as inverted. And if we invert that inversion, we go back to the original, but we're just going to keep it as add. And we're going to rename this so we can say that this is screen. And like we said, we can add, subtract. We need that bottom bracket, so I'm going to highlight our screen, hit Control D, and if I hit M for mask, I can do a subtract. And now we've got the top part and we've got the bottom bracket. I'm going to name this appropriately. This is bracket. Now, another cool thing you can do with masks is that you don't have to just put them on an object. You can also tell an object to use another object as a mask. So without anything highlighted, I can go up here to our toolbar, select our shape again, and now because we don't have anything selected while we're trying to draw it out, it's just going to draw out a shape. and we can actually see that shape as opposed to the mask. If you don't see it like this, you may need to go click on fill and then hit solid color, and then it doesn't matter what color, we're just using the alpha. It's a shape layer right now, but we can call it mask. And if I move this over the bracket, toggle my mode so I can see what my track mats are, then I can say, hey, take the alpha mat of that top layer. It's going to do something very interesting. First, the bracket disappeared, and also our mask is turned transparent. What happened? Well, if we select our mask and we move it around here, we can see that it's acting as a mask for the bottom layer. And so not only does this bracket have a mask on it to say like, hey, subtract this screen from it, but I also want you to, in addition to that, use this track layer data to say like, if it's within this square with an alpha mat, include it, like show that data. So it's not going to show, if I hide the screen here and highlight that mask, the data is already saying like hide everything up here because of that mask. But as we move this mask down, the data that's overlapping and both saying yes to, it's showing it. So we're going to turn our screen back on. We're going to take our mask and we're going to try our best to line it up with the top here. And we're going to, despite what I would actually do in a project, we're going to ignore all that stuff that we had just done. Turn off that bracket so we just have the screen. And we're going to get into keyframing. If you've spent any time in After Effects, you know what keyframes are, but they are basically just little points that you're telling the computer, move these particular parameters around to this spot that I've chosen. And then you're going to sort of calculate out what you think is best in between. It's easier if I show you. Go to our screen here. I'm going to hit P for position, right? Now, if I hit this stopwatch here, it's going to set a keyframe saying like, remember this spot at 0 seconds. And if I go out to, 1 second, and I move that down, and now I preview that by hitting either 0 or spacebar, you'll see that it is now moving between those 2 points. Pretty cool. The cool thing is you can set this to a number of different properties. If we twirl down this caret on the screen instead of using shortcuts, you can see that on average what you can do is you can move the anchor point around. That's this little crosshair thing, and think of it kind of like on that layer, it's like a joint. So like how my shoulder rotates and like the arm moves from that point, that's kind of like the anchor point. So if I take this screen and I scale it, it's scaling from that position. If I rotate it, it's rotating from that position. You got position here, which we've already seen. You can move it around. You've got scale position to increase or decrease the scale. You've got rotation, which is R on the shortcuts. And you've got opacity, which sets the opacity. Weird point about this one, the shortcut is actually T. So remember, T for transparency, not O for opacity. I probably shouldn't even said that because you're going to remember that. Just remember T. So now that we've got that out of the way, let's figure out, where this is going to move. And in order to do that, we're going to need to see our bracket and also our first problem and why we have that mask. So I'm going to turn on that bracket. We can't see it because first off, we've excluded the screen and we have also excluded the mask from the top. So let's change the alpha mat to inverted for a second. And so it's going to say like, hey, subtract that as well. And now if I move the screen down with a keyframe, so I'm going to set this keyframe, and I kind of want this to be the last frame, right? This is where it's going to end, so I'm going to move that forward. And instead, on this position, I'm going to move our thing down so it matches with the floor of our bracket. So we've got that first part of our animation done because we've added some keyframes for position, and we also see our first problem, which is that we can see our brackets straight through our screen. Why is that? Well, because it's a vector, and the vector only had included the outline of the screen. These are just lines. But we can use masks again to hide that, and that's why we had made that mask earlier. So if we go to the end point here, we can turn on that mask, and we can use that mask, if we highlight it, I'll shut it off again so you can see, to hide it like this. So if we just move this and keyframe it, we can make it hide. So if we take this mask, and we add some keyframes here. So this is where we want it to end. We bring it down here. We can hide that, and then it reveals. Now you can see there's another problem with that, is that you're gonna have to get like all finicky to make it match. But we don't have to worry about that because we can use the position data already that we used from our screen onto the mask. And we can do that by using nulls and parenting, which we'll get into. So Let me just delete this position stuff on the mask. What is parenting? Think of it, it's very much like the analogy or what it refers to. Basically, you can make one object follow another object within your timeline. And if you take this mask here and we take this pick whip and we pick whip it to the screen, what we have said is, hey, this mask is now a child of the screen. And like a good child, that child will follow the screen wherever it goes. So if we play it, we can sort of see it's still a little janky. We got some lines showing here, but this mask is following the position data of the screen. And whatever that parent does, whether it's the anchor points, whether it is the scale of the stuff, it's gonna follow it around. So let's see, screen, I'm gonna go scale. You can see that the mask changes in size too. And if you ever want to make a change to an object and its stuff has been parented to it, you can just go here to the parent and link, select it off, and now you can scale things or whatever, and it's not going to follow. But if it is following, then it's doing everything the parent wants to do. However, like children and parents in real life, sometimes the children will do crazy stuff and the parents are not going to copy the kids. Like cool, your kid eats glue in kindergarten, the parent's not going to do that. So if we see like the mask here, hit the scale button, or S for scale, keyframe that, and let's make it go crazy, like it scales up, right? You can see that even though the mask is following its parent, the parent is not following that crazy scaling going on. So that's important to note. So you can do things where you're affecting another object, but then maintain other animations on the children and not affect everything. I said that terribly, but you know what I mean. So let's take off that scale. Let's fix this up a little bit here. Another thing you can really do with parenting that's really cool is use nulls in conjunction. And nulls are basically objects that exist, but they don't. They're like ghosts. So if I go up here to layer and I go to new and I go to null object, we've added this null object to the scene. But if we play it, it doesn't show up. It's only when we're working with it do we see this little red square. And so if I were to take this red square, I'm going to call this scale, and I parent my screen to this scale, right? Then I parent the bracket to this scale. We're not going to do anything to the mask because it's already parented to the screen to pick up its position data. And if we move that over to the scale, we're actually going to lose that portion. Let me show you. So if I play this now, you'll see that nothing shows up because the mask has not picked up that position. But if we, again, we're at the back at the beginning, parent it to the screen, that screen is parented to the scale. So we have a child who's a parent, and then a parent who's also a child of a parent, which is like how it works in real life. So it's technically following the grandparents, I guess, at this point. Anyhow, now that we have this powerful connection made to the null, we can do this cool thing where I hit S for scale in the null, and I can set that to 0, and then keyframe out 1 second, set that to 100. And now we have the scale property controlling everything else because of that parent-child relationship. So we have now 2 simultaneous actions. And you look at that and you're like, that doesn't look quite right. Remember, it's inheriting everything from the parent. So if I go here to the end here, I'm going to take off the parent to that scaling function. And this little cross here is the anchor point. That's the joint, right? So that's where everything's scaling up. One little trick, we can make it scale from the bottom where the bracket is. So now that we've moved it down, we can take the things that we want to parent it to, again, reparent it, and now it's going to move from that position. So now we have this kind of cool, it's like growing in place from that single spot. Right? Cool. Now we have this animation, it's sort of getting there. There's a little, glitches here and there we'll figure out. Let's add some complexity, right? It's small, basic motions that are going to make a more complex whole. And you know what? Like, I want to animate that bezel on separately. And we can use masks to separate that out from our screen and then add it back in. So if we highlight our screen here, I'm going to take my rectangle, and I'm going to draw another mask around that bezel. And I'm going to say, instead of add, subtract. Boom, it's gone. But if I duplicate that screen, and I did that by hitting Control D, and I delete our, let's see here, we got the peach mask, we don't want that, we just want that bezel mask. but we set it instead of a subtract to an add. It's back in there. It's animating with everything else. But let's say you take out that position stuff, hit S for scale, and I can set a keyframe for this one now. But instead of scaling in a kind of like in all directions, X and Y equally, I can turn off the constraint proportions and then move our keyframe out here. So this is our final shot, right? Like this. Go back to the beginning and set maybe our X to 0. So now it's growing in place. Pretty cool. It's following the scale, but you can sort of see it's not growing with the rest of the screen. So maybe instead of to the scale, we just parent this to the screen. So now it's growing correctly. Now, our animation, I would say, is basic. It still kind of sucks. And this is when you would add the secret sauce, which is easy ease to your keyframes. It's like ketchup, or I don't know what the correct analogy is. Ketchup, sriracha, it's something you can add to everything, every keyframe, and it makes it just better. And so you can do that by highlighting the keyframes that you want to easy ease, right click on top of those keyframes, go to Keyframe Assistant, and then easy ease. Or if you want to save some time, highlight those keyframes and hit F9. And so what are we doing here? So if you highlight scale, for instance, and go to this thing called the graph editor, and you make sure that your graph here on this symbol is set to speed graph and scale in here, this is the speed with which the animation is happening. And you can sort of see that it starts out a little bit slow, it accelerates, and then it decelerates, right? And so instead of a linear, and let's convert this back, and we can do that by right-clicking. So remember this, it's kind of just coming up and it stops, right? Highlight scale, go into here. It's going, it stops, very jagged. But things don't move like that in real life. There's inertia and friction. So if we highlight those keyframes, hit F9 and go back into it, we have that easy ease. Look at how it goes now. It's just a little bit sexier, right? And if we highlight down here, drag and click across those keyframes, these are the, by the way, these are the keyframes, and it's just the X and Y value. Like, yeah, you know, when you're in math class and you've got a plot on X and Y, it's just showing you that data. While you're in the graph editor, highlight either or the keyframes, you'll come up with these handles. You can drag it in. You can make it as a steeper curve. And now look at what it looks like when it's like that. Now, ooh, there's something kind of polished about that. We can do the same thing for the screen. We've added the easy ease. Let's drag those. Ooh, that feels good. Feels real good. Here, that screen movement right down here, F9, I'm gonna do the same thing here. And you can tweak this to your taste. Play around with it, see how it feels. Oh, that feels really good. Man, that looks pro. And we've just done this with a simple set of masks on an image. And so there you go. It's a very polished kind of icon animation where it's coming from nothing. And we did that just by masking out one image and then using some keyframes that are easy eased with some parenting in Nulls. Hopefully that's been helpful. In the next video, we're gonna go ahead and dig into the cell phone where we'll actually redraw the icon and use the built-in trim paths property to make it build out all sexy like. If you don't wanna miss it, do the bell thing and the thing that helps my ego down below. And if you have any questions about this or comments, feel free to drop them in the comments. Thanks for watching, and hopefully I'll see you next time.